All names, places, and institutions are aliases used to protect privacy. Procedures and timelines reflect real-world law and court practice for immersion. The oak-paneled courtroom at Atlas Hall smells faintly of floor polish and old paper, a scent that has settled into every corner of this third-floor trial division on a late Thursday afternoon. Judge Keystone sits at the bench, fingers drumming softly on the blotter, her gaze locked onto the witness stand, where a man in a pale blue shirt sits under oath, aliased here as Witness Vale, his hands folded in his lap with a stillness that seems almost rehearsed. Defense Attorney North stands at the podium halfway through a cross-examination that has already gone longer than anyone expected, his voice calm, but edged with something sharper, and Prosecutor Slate leans back in his chair at the table opposite, his mouth a tight line. The gallery murmurs when North pauses and glances up at the bench, then back to the witness, and the silence that follows feels like the intake of breath before a door slams shut. Judge Keystone has been watching the rhythm of Vale's answers all afternoon. The slight pauses before he agrees, the way his eyes drift to the prosecutor's table before he responds, and she interrupts now with a question no one expected. "Mr. Vale, have you spoken with counsel for the state outside the presence of this court, or opposing counsel regarding your testimony today?" The courtroom stills. Vale's eyes widen for just a fraction of a second, and North straightens at the podium, his hand freezing on his notepad. Slate sits forward, already objecting on grounds of scope, but Judge Keystone raises one hand, and Vale, after a long pause, says only, "I don't understand the question, Your Honor." The judge leans forward slightly. "Did anyone from the prosecutor's office meet with you this morning, before you took the stand, in violation of my order that witnesses were to remain sequestered?" Vale swallows, and the courtroom waits, because everyone knows that what he says next will either vindicate the state's case or tear it apart from the inside. And what none of them yet understand is that the judge's attempt to expose one lie is about to ignite a procedural firestorm that will consume the entire hearing, backfire against her own authority, and force an appellate court to step in before the day is out. If you're interested in how courtroom procedure can unravel even the most confident rulings, subscribe and drop a comment below, because this case shows exactly how a judge's pursuit of the truth can become a trap. The case styled State v. Rook began 6 months earlier with a felony charge of embezzlement from Granite County's largest nonprofit, a community development organization known under the alias Harbor Trust. Defendant Rook, a 34-year-old accountant, stood accused of diverting funds through falsified invoices over a 3-year period, and the state's theory relied heavily on the testimony of 2 witnesses, Rook's former supervisor, aliased Merrick, and a financial auditor from an independent firm, aliased Vale, who had been retained to review Harbor Trust's books after the irregularities surfaced. Vale's report had formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, detailing specific transactions that appeared to bypass standard controls, and his anticipated testimony was expected to walk the jury through a paper trail the state claimed was unambiguous. Defense Attorney North, retained by Rook and known in Granite County for his meticulous trial preparation, had filed a pre-trial motion to exclude portions of Vale's testimony on hearsay grounds, arguing that Vale's conclusions relied on statements made by Harbor Trust employees who would not be available for cross-examination. Judge Keystone denied the motion in a written order, but she also issued a sequestration order under the rules of evidence, directing that all witnesses, including Vale, remain outside the courtroom and refrain from discussing their testimony with counsel once trial began, to preserve the integrity of their individual accounts and prevent coordination that could distort the record. 2 weeks before trial, however, North's investigator discovered something troubling, a series of emails between Prosecutor Slate and Vale's firm, some exchanged after the sequestration order was in place, discussing clarifications to Vale's testimony, and scheduling a meeting at the prosecutor's office the morning before Vale was set to take the stand. North filed a sealed motion alleging an ex parte communication, that is, a conversation between one party and a witness, or the court that excludes the opposing party and violates procedural fairness, and requesting an evidentiary hearing. Ex parte rules exist precisely to prevent one side from shaping testimony or evidence in secret, and violations can lead to sanctions, exclusion of evidence, or even mistrial, because the integrity of an adversarial proceeding depends on both parties having equal access to information and equal opportunity to challenge it. Judge Keystone scheduled a hearing for the afternoon before trial was set to resume, intending to address North's motion in chambers. But North insisted the hearing occur on the record in open court, arguing that any finding of impropriety would affect the credibility of the state's key witness, and that the defendant had a right to a public airing of the issue. Judge Keystone reluctantly agreed, and that decision set the stage for a confrontation that would test the boundaries of her contempt power, the ethical obligations of both attorneys, and the structural safeguards that prevent a single judge's authority from overriding appellate oversight. The proceeding began at 2 p.m, with the case called in open court, counsel announcing their appearances, and Judge Keystone stating the purpose of the hearing: to determine whether Prosecutor Slate or anyone from his office had engaged in prohibited communication with witness Vale in violation of the court's sequestration order, and if so, what remedy was appropriate. Slate rose first, his tone formal and controlled, and argued that any meetings with Vale were necessary to prepare the witness, and that the sequestration order applied only to preventing witnesses from hearing each other's testimony, not to prohibiting legitimate pre-trial consultations. North countered immediately, citing the plain language of the court's order, which had explicitly stated that witnesses were not to discuss their testimony with counsel once sequestration is invoked, and that Judge Keystone herself had invoked it at the close of jury selection, before any witness had testified. The exchange escalated quickly. Slate accused North of gamesmanship and attempting to exclude critical evidence on a technicality, while North responded that the state was attempting to coach a witness in violation of a court order, which, if proven, would constitute contempt of court, a willful disobedience of a judicial directive that can result in fines, imprisonment, or both, and is one of the most serious assertions an attorney can make against opposing counsel. Judge Keystone interrupted, her voice sharp, and directed both attorneys to focus on the facts. She ordered Prosecutor Slate to produce any written communications between his office and Vale or Vale's firm, and Slate hesitated, just long enough for the gallery to notice, before stating, "Your Honor, those communications are work product and attorney-client privileged. I respectfully decline to produce them without a more specific showing of relevance." North was on his feet before Slate finished, arguing that privilege cannot shield evidence of misconduct, and Judge Keystone's expression darkened. What followed was a legal clash that revealed the tension between a judge's authority to control her courtroom and the constraints imposed by rules of professional conduct and appellate review. Judge Keystone ordered Slate to produce the emails in camera, that is, for the judge's private review, within the hour, and warned that refusal would be treated as contempt. Slate, visibly tense, requested a sidebar, and Judge Keystone granted it. The court reporter followed, and for 5 minutes the three figures huddled near the bench while the gallery watched in silence. When they returned, Slate stated on the record that he had explained to the court, off the record, the sensitive nature of the communications and requested an opportunity to consult with his supervising attorney and the county's ethics counsel before complying. Judge Keystone denied the request, stating that the order was immediate and that any further delay would prejudice the defendant's right to a fair trial. North, sensing an opening, pressed further. He moved to call Vale as a witness in the hearing itself, to testify under oath about the nature and timing of his communications with the state. Prosecutor Slate objected on grounds that Vale was still under sequestration, and that calling him now would violate the very rule North claimed to be defending. Judge Keystone paused, visibly weighing the arguments, and then ruled in North's favor. Vale would be called. The sequestration rule was subordinate to the court's need to determine whether its own order had been violated, and Vale would testify immediately. Vale was brought into the courtroom under the watchful eyes of the gallery, sworn in by the clerk, and took the stand with the same outward calm he had displayed earlier, though his hands now gripped the edge of the witness box. Defense Attorney North conducted the examination with surgical precision, beginning with foundational questions. When Vale had been retained, when he had completed his report, when he had first met with Prosecutor Slate's office, Vale answered each question carefully, his voice steady, and confirmed that he had attended multiple meetings with the prosecutor in the months leading up to trial. North then asked, "Mr. Vale, did you meet with anyone from the Granite County Prosecutor's office this morning after jury selection concluded and after Judge Keystone invoked the sequestration rule?" Vale hesitated, glanced towards Slate, and answered, "I met with Mr. Slate briefly to go over my notes." North nodded slowly. "And during that meeting, did Mr. Slate discuss the specific questions he would ask you on direct examination?" Vale's pause stretched longer this time, and Judge Keystone leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Vale, you are under oath. Answer the question." Vale exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly, and said, "Yes, we went over the questions." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and Judge Keystone struck her gavel once sharply. North pressed further. "Did Mr. Slate suggest how you should answer any of those questions, or suggest that you emphasize certain findings in your report over others?" Vale's expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips pressing together, and he answered, "He reminded me to keep my answers clear and not to speculate." North paused, letting the answer hang in the air, and then asked the question that would fracture the entire proceeding. "Mr. Vale, did Mr. Slate tell you to say anything that you believed to be untrue, or to omit anything that you believed to be relevant?" Vale's face went pale, and for a moment he did not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "He told me that certain details in my report, specifically notes I made about missing source documents that I couldn't verify, might confuse the jury, and that I should focus on the transactions I could verify." North's eyes narrowed. "And did you include those notes about missing documents in the final version of the report you gave to the state?" Vale hesitated again. "No, I removed them at Mr. Slate's request." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. North turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, I move to exclude Mr. Vale's testimony in its entirety, and I move for sanctions against the state for witness tampering and violation of the court's sequestration order." Prosecutor Slate shot to his feet, his voice rising for the first time. "Your Honor, that is a gross mischaracterization. Mr. Vale's revisions to his report were made in the ordinary course of consultation, and defense counsel is twisting routine trial preparation into—" Judge Keystone cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Slate, you will have an opportunity to respond. Sit down." Slate sat, his jaw clenched, and Judge Keystone turned her attention back to Vale. "Mr. Vale, did you remove findings from your report because you believed they were irrelevant, or because Mr. Slate told you to?" Vale swallowed. "Mr. Slate told me they could hurt the case." The judge's expression hardened. "And did you believe those findings were material? That is, relevant to the question of whether the defendant committed the alleged embezzlement?" Vale nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. The missing documents were relevant because they would have shown that some of the transactions I attributed to the defendant might have been authorized by someone else. The courtroom fell silent, and Judge Keystone closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them and stared directly at Prosecutor Slate. What happened next was the turning point, the moment when Judge Keystone's attempt to assert control and expose misconduct transformed into a procedural error that would unravel her authority and force an appellate intervention. Judge Keystone addressed Slate directly from the bench, her voice cold and measured. "Mr. Slate, based on the testimony I have just heard, I find that you knowingly violated this court sequestration order, that you engaged in conduct that amounts to witness tampering by causing a material witness to omit relevant findings from his report, and that your actions have compromised the integrity of this proceeding. I'm holding you in contempt of court. Bailiff, take Mr. Slate into custody." The gallery gasped, and Slate stood frozen at counsel table, his face draining of color. North remained at the podium, his expression unreadable, while the bailiff, alias Deputy Holloway, stepped forward uncertainly, glancing between the judge and the prosecutor. Slate found his voice shaking slightly. "Your Honor, I request an immediate stay of that order and an opportunity to be heard. You cannot hold me in contempt without due process. I have a right to present a defense, to call witnesses, to—" Judge Keystone interrupted, her tone unyielding. "You had an opportunity to comply with my order, and you chose to mislead this court. The contempt is direct. I witnessed your refusal and your conduct in open court. I am within my authority, under the rules governing contempt in the face of the court, to impose sanctions immediately. Deputy Holloway, please escort Mr. Slate to the holding area until I determine an appropriate penalty." But Judge Keystone's assertion of authority contained a critical flaw, one that defense attorney North recognized instantly, and that Prosecutor Slate's supervising attorney, aliased Senior Prosecutor Vance, who had been seated in the gallery observing, understood even more clearly. Contempt of court comes in two forms: direct contempt, which occurs in the presence of the court and can be punished summarily with minimal procedure, and indirect or constructive contempt, which occurs outside the court's presence and requires a full hearing with notice, an opportunity to present a defense, and the chance to call witnesses. Judge Keystone had characterized Slate's conduct as direct contempt, but the core of her finding, that Slate had violated the sequestration order and tampered with Vale's testimony, was based on events that occurred outside the courtroom, in meetings held in Slate's office, which Vale had only just testified about. Direct contempt applies to acts such as shouting at the judge, physically disrupting proceedings, or refusing to obey an order while standing in open court. It does not typically extend to conduct that must be proven through witness testimony about off-the-record meetings, even if that testimony is elicited during the hearing itself. Senior Prosecutor Vance stood and addressed the court, her voice firm but professional. "Your Honor, I am Senior Prosecutor Vance from the Granite County Prosecutor's Office. I request permission to be heard on behalf of Mr. Slate." Judge Keystone, clearly irritated, granted permission. Vance argued that the contempt finding was procedurally defective because Slate had not been given notice that he might be held in contempt, had not been afforded a separate hearing with the opportunity to present evidence or call witnesses in his defense, and that the conduct alleged was not direct contempt, but rather required the procedural protections afforded to indirect contempt proceedings. Vance cited controlling case law and requested that the court vacate the contempt order, and if it chose to pursue contempt, schedule a proper hearing with full procedural safeguards. Judge Keystone, now visibly flustered, responded that Slate's conduct was sufficiently egregious to warrant immediate action, and that the court had inherent authority to maintain order and enforce its own directives. Vance pressed further. Your Honor, with respect, the appellate courts in this jurisdiction have made clear that summary contempt power must be exercised with restraint, and only in cases of conduct that directly disrupts or disrespects the court in its presence. The conduct you are sanctioning, meetings with a witness and alleged tampering, occurred outside this courtroom and must be addressed through a separate contempt proceeding, not through summary punishment. If you proceed with this order as it stands, I will immediately seek an emergency stay from the Court of Appeals, and I believe the appellate court will find that you exceeded your authority. The threat hung in the air, and Judge Keystone's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. She called a 15-minute recess, and the courtroom emptied into a buzzing hallway where spectators, attorneys, and reporters exchanged hurried whispers about what they had just witnessed. When court reconvened, Judge Keystone had softened her stance slightly. She stated on the record that she was modifying her order to release Prosecutor Slate from custody, but that she was maintaining a finding of contempt and imposing a sanction of $5,000 to be paid within 30 days, and referring the matter to the State Bar's Disciplinary Committee for investigation of potential ethical violations. Slate, still pale but no longer facing immediate detention, accepted the modification without further objection, and Senior Prosecutor Vance stated that the state would be filing a notice of appeal and a motion for stay with the Court of Appeals within the hour. The immediate logistical fallout was swift and chaotic. Judge Keystone declared a mistrial in state ver. Rook, finding that the integrity of the proceeding had been irreparably compromised and that the defendant could not receive a fair trial with Vale's testimony tainted by evidence of tampering. Defendant Rook, who had sat silent and wide-eyed throughout the hearing, exchanged a brief, stunned look with Defense Attorney North, who nodded once, conveying a mix of relief and caution. The jury, which had been sequestered in a separate room and knew nothing of the afternoon's drama, was brought into the courtroom and dismissed by Judge Keystone with a brief explanation that legal issues had arisen requiring the case to be retried at a later date. The jurors filed out, some glancing back in confusion, and the gallery slowly dispersed, leaving only the attorneys, the court staff, and a handful of reporters who immediately began typing on their phones. Senior Prosecutor Vance approached Defense Attorney North in the hallway outside the courtroom and offered a terse acknowledgement. "This isn't over. We'll be back." North replied evenly, "We'll be ready." And both attorneys departed through separate exits. By 6 that evening, the Court of Appeals had received Slate's emergency motion for stay and a motion to vacate the contempt finding, supported by a detailed memorandum arguing that Judge Keystone had committed reversible error by applying summary contempt procedures to conduct that required a full, indirect contempt hearing, and that the fine and bar referral should be set aside pending appellate review. The appellate process moved with unusual speed, a reflection of the seriousness of the issues and the professional stakes for Prosecutor Slate. Within 48 hours, a 3-judge panel of the Court of Appeals issued an administrative stay, a temporary order freezing Judge Keystone's sanctions while the appellate court reviewed the merits of the contempt finding. The stay meant that Slate would not be required to pay the fine or face bar discipline until the appellate court ruled, and it signaled that the panel had identified at least preliminary concerns about the procedural sufficiency of Judge Keystone's order. The appellate court scheduled expedited briefing, with Slate's opening brief due within 2 weeks, the trial court's response due 1 week later, and oral argument set for the following month. Defense Attorney North, representing Defendant Rook, filed a separate brief as an interested party, arguing that regardless of the contempt issue, the mistrial was justified and that any retrial should exclude Vale's testimony entirely or at minimum require the state to disclose all communications with Vale prior to trial. The appellate briefing revealed a sharp divide. Slate's brief argued that Judge Keystone had acted arbitrarily, without affording him basic due process, and that the alleged conduct, pretrial consultations with a witness, was within the bounds of ordinary trial preparation and did not constitute contempt. Judge Keystone's response, filed through the county attorney's office, defended her actions as necessary to preserve the integrity of the trial, and argued that Slate's conduct was direct contempt because he had refused to produce documents in open court and had engaged in knowing deception about the extent of his communications with Vail. North's brief sided with Judge Keystone on the mistrial, but argued that the contempt finding, while procedurally flawed, was substantively justified, and that appellate courts should not shield prosecutors from accountability for witness tampering. 6 weeks after the hearing, the Court of Appeals issued a published opinion that upended Judge Keystone's contempt order and sent a clear message about the limits of summary contempt power. The panel held that Judge Keystone had erred by characterizing Slate's conduct as direct contempt and imposing sanctions without affording him a separate hearing with full procedural protections. The opinion noted that while the trial court's concern about witness tampering was legitimate, the conduct at issue, meetings that occurred outside the courtroom and were proven only through Vail's testimony, fell squarely within the category of indirect contempt, which requires notice, a hearing, and an opportunity for the alleged contemner to present a defense. The appellate court vacated the contempt finding and the associated fine, and it also vacated the referral to the state bar, holding that any disciplinary referral must be based on a valid finding of misconduct, which the trial court had not properly established. However, the opinion did not exonerate Slate. Instead, it remanded the matter to the trial court with instructions to conduct a proper indirect contempt hearing if Judge Keystone still believed that sanctions were warranted, and it directed the trial court to make specific findings about whether Slate's communications with Vail violated the sequestration order, and if so, whether those violations rose to the level of contempt or instead warranted lesser remedies such as exclusion of testimony or a curative instruction. The appellate court also addressed the mistrial, holding that Judge Keystone had not abused her discretion in declaring a mistrial given the evidence of potential witness tampering, but it declined to rule on whether Vail's testimony should be excluded in any retrial, leaving that decision to the trial court on remand with instructions to hold an evidentiary hearing and apply the appropriate standards for exclusion based on prosecutorial misconduct. The backfire was complete, and its contours were now visible to everyone involved. Judge Keystone, who had sought to assert control over her courtroom and hold a prosecutor accountable for what she believed was a clear violation of her order, instead found herself rebuked by a higher court for exceeding her authority and failing to follow procedural rules designed to protect against arbitrary punishment. The appellate opinion, while carefully worded, implicitly criticized her for acting in the heat of the moment without pausing to consider whether summary contempt was the appropriate mechanism. And legal observers in Granite County noted that the published decision would likely be cited in future cases as a cautionary tale about the limits of judicial power. Prosecutor Slate, though spared the immediate financial penalty and bar referral, now faced the prospect of a second contempt hearing where he would be required to defend his conduct under oath and on a full record, and he also faced the possibility that the state bar would initiate its own independent investigation based on the appellate court's remand order. His professional reputation had been damaged, and his handling of the Rook case became a subject of internal review within the Granite County Prosecutor's Office, with Senior Prosecutor Vance reassigned to oversee any retrial and Slate removed from the case entirely. Defense Attorney North, meanwhile, saw his client's prospects improve dramatically. The mistrial meant that Rook would not face immediate conviction, and the appellate court's remand order gave North a strong basis to argue that Vale's testimony should be excluded or, at minimum, heavily scrutinized in any retrial, which would gut the state's case and likely lead to a dismissal or a favorable plea agreement. Defendant Rook, for his part, remained free on bond, but deeply anxious about the uncertainty of a retrial and the knowledge that his fate still hung on legal battles that could stretch on for months. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate parties and into the broader legal community and public discourse. Local media covered the appellate decision extensively, framing it as a clash between judicial authority and prosecutorial accountability, and editorials appeared in Granite County's newspapers debating whether Judge Keystone had been right to act decisively or whether she had overreached in a moment of anger. Legal ethics professors in the state used the case as a teaching tool, discussing the fine line between legitimate trial preparation and witness tampering, the importance of sequestration rules in preserving testimonial integrity, and the procedural safeguards that prevent summary punishment from becoming a tool of judicial caprice. Defense attorneys across the jurisdiction took note of the case as a reminder that aggressive advocacy in challenging prosecutorial conduct could yield results, but also as a warning that procedural missteps by a trial judge could complicate outcomes and delay justice. Prosecutors, conversely, viewed the case as a cautionary example of the risks of ex parte communication and the need for meticulous documentation of all witness consultations to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The case also prompted internal policy reviews within the Granite County Prosecutor's Office, with new guidelines issued requiring that all witness meetings be logged, that no substantive discussions of testimony occur after sequestration is invoked, and that any requests from witnesses to revise reports or statements be documented in writing and disclosed to opposing counsel. Judge Keystone herself faced professional consequences that were less formal but no less significant. While she was not sanctioned by any judicial oversight body, the appellate court's public rebuke damaged her credibility and led to quiet conversations among her colleagues on the bench about the need for restraint in using contempt power. In subsequent cases, attorneys noted that Judge Keystone became more cautious in her rulings, more willing to grant procedural requests from both sides, and less prone to issuing summary orders without full briefing, a shift that some interpreted as a healthy correction and others saw as a loss of the decisiveness that had once defined her courtroom. She declined to pursue a second contempt hearing against Prosecutor Slate after the remand, instead issuing a brief order stating that the interests of justice were better served by allowing the state bar to investigate and that the court would focus its attention on resolving the underlying criminal case. That decision was widely interpreted as an acknowledgement that her initial contempt finding had been a mistake and that she did not wish to risk another appellate reversal. The retrial of State versus Rook never occurred. 3 months after the appellate decision, the Granite County Prosecutor's Office announced that it was dismissing the embezzlement charge against Rook, citing insufficient evidence to proceed and concerns about the integrity of key witness testimony. The dismissal was framed in neutral language, but legal insiders understood it as a quiet concession that without Vale's testimony, or with Vale's testimony now impeached by his own admission that he had removed material findings at the prosecutor's request, the state's case could not survive a motion for judgment of acquittal. Defense Attorney North issued a statement calling the dismissal long overdue and expressing hope that the case would prompt reforms in how prosecutors interact with expert witnesses. Defendant Rook, now cleared of charges, gave a brief interview in which he described the ordeal as a nightmare and said he had lost faith in the system but was grateful to his attorney for fighting on his behalf. Prosecutor Slate, who had remained silent throughout the appellate process, left the Granite County prosecutor's office 6 months later to take a position in private practice, a move that colleagues attributed to the reputational damage from the Rook case and the stress of the prolonged bar investigation, which ultimately concluded with a private reprimand but no public sanction. The legal and ethical lessons embedded in the case became a subject of ongoing discussion in Granite County and beyond. The ex parte communication rules that Judge Keystone had sought to enforce exist precisely to prevent the kind of one-sided shaping of testimony that occurred when Prosecutor Slate met with Vail after sequestration was invoked, and the appellate court's remand order reaffirmed that those rules are not mere technicalities but essential safeguards of trial fairness. At the same time, the case illustrated the danger of judicial overreach. A judge's legitimate concern about misconduct can lead to summary punishment that violates due process and undermines the very fairness the judge seeks to protect. The contempt power is one of the most potent tools a judge possesses, but it is also one of the most easily abused, and the procedural distinctions between direct and indirect contempt exist to ensure that no person, attorney, witness, or litigant is punished without a meaningful opportunity to be heard. The case also underscored the importance of appellate review as a check on trial court authority. The Court of Appeal's willingness to issue an emergency stay and to publish a decision rebuking the trial judge sent a signal that procedural rules matter and that no judge, regardless of good intentions, is above the law. Finally, the case highlighted the human cost of procedural breakdowns. Defendant Rook spent months in legal limbo. Prosecutor Slate's career trajectory was altered, Judge Keystone's reputation suffered, and public confidence in the integrity of the courtroom was shaken, all because a series of choices: Slate's decision to meet with Vail in violation of sequestration, Judge Keystone's decision to impose summary contempt, and the subsequent legal battles, collided in a way that served no one's interests and delayed justice for everyone. Late on a Friday evening, weeks after the charges against Rook were dismissed, the third-floor courtroom at Atlas Hall sits empty and dark, the only light coming from the exit sign above the rear door and the faint glow of street lamps filtering through the high windows. The witness stand is unoccupied, the podium cleared, the judge's bench silent. In the small office 2 floors below, Defense Attorney North sits alone, reviewing a file for an unrelated case. But his thoughts drift back to that Thursday afternoon when everything unraveled, and he wonders whether the system corrected itself or simply stumbled into a result that happened to favor his client. Across town, in a dimly lit study, former prosecutor Slate stares at a letter from the state bar confirming the conclusion of its investigation. The words "private reprimand" stamped across the top, and he reflects on the cost of decisions made in haste and the fragility of a career built on credibility. Judge Keystone, in her chambers preparing for Monday's docket, pauses over the appellate court's opinion, now filed in a binder with other significant rulings, and she underlines a passage about the necessity of procedural restraint, a reminder that authority without discipline is not justice, but its opposite. And somewhere in Granite County, a future defendant will sit in a courtroom and trust that the rules will be followed, that witnesses will tell the truth, and that judges will act with fairness, never knowing how close the system came to failing in a case called State versus Rook, and how a single moment of overreach taught everyone involved that catching a lie is meaningless if the process used to expose it is itself a lie. If this deep dive into courtroom procedure and the mechanics of judicial power resonated with you, consider subscribing, because the law is not just about outcomes, but about how we get there. And the story of what happens when that process breaks down is one we all need to understand.